subject on Varroa treatment is still important. This is for sure. Beside the fact that there are so many companies doing a good job of developing drugs and advertising them, and beekeepers get trained in how to use all these substances, we observe a high and increasing loss of colonies, especially during the winter period. As one example, I took data from the German bee monitoring program, where we check about 120 apiaries each year, and this is a tendency over the years. So the winter loss rate is somewhere between 7 to 16, 18%. We had some serious years where it was even higher. And what we know, if bees are really healthy and get an optimal maintenance by the beekeeper, then the losses should be below 5%. So something is going wrong. And the main cause for this is clearly Varroa colonies, who looks like this. So the mite together with the secondary infections, which causes these losses. So what's to do at that point? I think it's no longer a question of more efficient drugs or a more frequent use of them. I'm pretty sure it's more about the strategy, how we treat the mites. And I will try to explain what is standing behind. It's basically to understand where the harm of varrosis is coming from. And this is mainly the fact that whenever the mite is inside a brood cell, the emerging bee is harmed for the rest of its life. I mean, it's there. The beekeeper can be happy in the first moment, or I got a young bee and the colony is developing well. But in fact, we know by now that there are so many changes, physiological changes, behavioral changes in those bees that they are not capable to normally rear-brood. They don't have a hive foraging ability and so on. So we can say all the infested brood is lost for the hive. And then it's a question how many % of the brood are affected. If it's just 2, 3, 5%, it's something which can easily be compensated by the colony. They produce a little bit more brood, and still the colony is in a good shape. But this is limited, of course. And once it goes up to about 10% or even higher infestation levels, the colony gets a serious problem. So to understand the dynamic, you need to check for the brood development, which is about this curve, steeply going up in early spring, reaching its peak in our region last few days of May, beginning of June. We have the peak in brood production, and then slightly going down. And if we are lucky, we have a brood stop somewhere for a few weeks in wintertime. And this has to be compared to the mite infestation. And this is the absolute number of mites from which we know as long as there's brood available, they can double the number inside the hive within a 3 to 4 weeks period. This is a normal growth rate of the mite population in the hive without regarding any mites coming in from outside or leaving the hive. So these are the two curves. And when we talk now about the risk for the colony to suffer from varrosis, you have to put both curves together. And this is the resulting one. So it's on a low level in early spring. And in the beginning of the season, the brood extension goes much faster than the number of mites is growing. So it's stable or can even go down here. But then later the season, when the peak of brood is reached and the brood is going down, and the mite population with its exponential growth is steeply going up, you have a quick change in a short period. And to read these values, don't go to the left side where we have a linear scaling. Go here where you have a logarithmic scaling. It's the only chance for me to show those data. Otherwise, they would go through the roof. And you see here, in this area, it's harmless with 5% brood infestation levels. But once we reach this level here of about 10%, we come into the red zone. And this is what regularly happens when we keep colonies in the way as it is a standard at the moment. You all learned you have to reduce the mites as far as possible during winter time. So we have a winter treatment. And then you start with 10 or 20 or 50 mites in the hive in the season. But still, this exponential growth is strong enough that about end of July, August sometimes, we reach this 10% level. And then you harvest your honey during the season. You don't have a chance to use any of those trucks, but at the moment where the honey is harvested, you start to treat, and you try to keep it down, and then later on you have a second or a third treatment and reduce finally the mite numbers during winter. This can't change the situation that we always are in the risk that in this critical period here, where the winter bee population is grown up in the hive, we exceed these levels. So it depends at the moment of the length of the season. There's a mild spring where the colonies start a few weeks earlier, and then you can be pretty sure that you get a problem later this season. Or it's about the temperature at the time of treatment, at the moment where we use thymol or formic acid. It depends so much on temperature and humidity, and then we get a problem at the moment where we don't reach this 80 or 90% efficacy, which often happens. And then further on, we rely so much on the winter treatment, but now we observe that the climate is changing, and we get more and more mild winters where some of the colonies even stay with brood all the time around. So this is the fundamental problem in the treatment strategy. And the question is, what could be the way out? And there I think we can, first of all, learn from natural honeybee behavior. So there is the swarming as a normal expression of each colony which wintered well and has a normal development. So it will split sometime in May or June. And what happens at that moment? The same data as you have seen before gives a completely different curve here, because the relative infestation is going up. But then with the swarming, you have about 4 weeks brood interruption in the hive. Part of the bee, together with the old queen, is going out. They take already some of the mites. But if you look what happens inside the colony, the queen stopped egg laying already some days before she left the hive. And then it lasts another week until the young queen can emerge. And it takes another week until she is ripe to get mated. And then another week until she starts egg laying. So it's 4 weeks at least, if the weather is fine. It could be 5 or 6 weeks without brood in the hive. And this is a very critical situation for the mites, because earlier or later, all of them are on the bees. And they are affected from grooming activities and similar things, and the mite reproduction is interrupted. So what happens is that the number of mites is going down in those periods. And then later on it grows again, of course, but you see it's unlikely that you exceed this 10% level later in the year. And this is the main reason why in these natural populations I was talking about yesterday, you can often observe that quite a number of colonies survives very well. The first season, the second season, and then you have selection within the population. So it's about this swarming. You could think now, aha, Ralf is coming here to tell us that we have to leave our colony swarming. Yeah, it could help. It could help, but this is not the advice I would like to give you, because I come from a bee institute. We train beekeepers. We care also for professional beekeepers, and at the moment where you have to deliver a pollination service or where you make a living out of your honey production, swarming is a terrible thing, because it reduces so much the honey yield. So we need better procedures. And how this can be done, I will explain. But first of all, let's better understand the effects of such a brood interruption as it occurs with swarming. So the first thing is, of course, there are some weeks where the mites can't reproduce. What is not so well known is that this interruption acts longer than the stop of brood, because mites, once established on the adult bee population, change their physiology. And when they later on get a chance to introduce brood again, they first of all have to change their physiology again. We know this from early spring. In the first or second brood cycles, mites usually don't reproduce on a normal level. The same happens after brood interruptions in summertime. The next 1 or 2 brood cycles are with a very low reproductive success of the mites. During those periods, you have a significant reduction in the number of mites. It's 10–15% of the mites which may leave with the swarm. But more important, at the moment where all the mites are on the bees, you have a daily loss. We have some calculations on this which show that it's about 1 to 2% of the total mite population placed on the bees, which are lost each day at the moment where the colonies are active. Bees are lost in the field, bees don't return, so we have comparisons where we check for the infestation level of outgoing bees and compare it with the infestation level of ingoing bees, and then you clearly see that they reduce the number of mites in the field. And there's grooming inside the hive and those things. So 1 to 2%. That means if you have 25 or 30 days of brood interruption, you lose 40 to 50% of the total mite population during this period. Very important. Then next point, it helps to reduce virus loads, because we know the final loss of colonies is due to the virus infections, and virus spread from one generation to the next. So this continuous brood production is the best starting position for viruses which infest the brood. So they can always go over from one cell to the other, and the mite is just the transfer help. A similar thing happens with the adult bee population. There again, you have a problem if young emerging bees are always in contact with elder bees who might be highly infested. So it's an easy spread of diseases then among the adult bees. The way to stop this is to have an exchange of the generations. And this, in fact, happens with natural swarming, because the remaining bees have to live, first of all, for the next 4 weeks until they start brood production again. And then it lasts another 3 weeks till the first young bees can emerge. So it's really a long period. And you know, these old bees do a good job to build up a new brood nest. But at the moment where brood emergence starts, then the old bees go out very soon. And you have a total renewal. It's really a change of the generations. The same happens with the swarm, but also with the remaining hive. And this reduces virus loads. And then last not least, swarming is connected with renewal of combs. So you have a clean brood nest, and the queen can start with a very compact brood nest, which is the best situation to rear healthy brood. And finally, if the brood stop happens at the right moment, it can even be a tool to increase the honey yield. And I will explain this later on. So if we put all those things together, we can easily say, yeah, this brood interruption during the season, this is the optimal starting situation to build up healthy winter colonies. So how can this be done in modern beekeeping management if we don't go for natural swarming? There's a cascade of questions you may answer for yourself to find out about the most suitable method for your personal conditions. The first question you have to answer: do you like to increase the colony number? So should this brood interruption be combined with what happens in nature? Propagation of colonies. Yes? Okay. Then the method is clear. Make a total brood removal and give the brood a chance to emerge, so put it in a brood collector, and then use the bees to build up new colonies. I will show this in practice afterwards. If you say no, then the next question turns up. Do you feel safe to find the queen among these 35,000 bees running around? If you say no, the answer is clear again. Make total brood removal, but don't spend time on this diseased brood. Just take it out, shake off all the bees, melt the brood. It's much better for the hive to be left without brood than it was before. The way is clear, very easy to handle, a method which can easily be adapted also in larger enterprises. So I know professional beekeepers who do this now with hundreds of colonies. If you find the queen, yes, then the final question, would you like to resign from any use of therapeutics? There are some beekeepers who would like really go for natural methods. If you say yes, then the method is this traditional trapping comb. It's highly effective, and it can replace the use of any therapeutics. If you say, no, this is less important, just to be sure that I have healthy colonies, then you can use the more easy way of just caging the queen over a longer period, and at the end of the caging period, when all the brood is gone, have a one-time treatment. But this is then somewhere in July, early August, right time to guarantee healthy winter bee production in the hive afterwards. So this is the three methods we have to discuss. Total brood removal, classical trapping comb, and caging. And to help you to better understand the things, I will show some pictures, so make like a quick procedure. First of all, the scheme for the total brood removal. The idea behind is copying the split which happens in natural swarming. So the queen with a big portion of the adult bee population goes out, and afterwards you have the brood remaining with some bees, and you have the second colony. But we just turn it around. We don't let the queen go out. We want to keep it under control, so we take the brood out. The split at the end is the same. And this is shown here. This is a brood nest. The red symbols show the brood combs. And what we do is we take out all the brood combs, while the queen with some food combs and plenty of bees remain in the former brood chamber. It's still on the same position. So all the elder bees which are already foraging know the entrance and return to this hive. And then on top, you leave the honey supers as they have been before. Yeah? Those go here. And the brood is then taken and melted if you don't need it. Or you go and collect it. And there you can easily put together the brood combs from several hives. Fill up your boxes so that it's comfortable for you in handling. We do it with 2 lorries, or we do it with 3 supers, depending on how many people can move the hive afterwards and so on. So this doesn't matter too much. About this shook swarm, as you may say here in the country, there is still the problem. 75 to 80% of the mites are probably inside the brood. They are out now. And some additional mites which were on the adult bees. But here are still 15 to 20% of the mite population remaining. And we would like to take the chance to improve the situation of natural swarming to attract those mites. And this is why we leave at least one comb with open brood. We call it a trapping comb. It remains inside the hive. The queen can immediately start to lay fresh eggs, but it will take 9 days until from those eggs you have the first sealed cells. And in this intermediate period, the only chance for the adult mites is to introduce the brood which is presented with a trapping comb. And it's about 85 to 90% of the mites which take this chance. So if we come 1 week later and take out the sealed trapping comb, we catch those mites. Easy way. The alternative is you use the moment where the colony is free of brood and have a one-time treatment. But of course, this depends on the honey flow. So you can do this after the honey harvest, but you couldn't do it during the flow to avoid residues in the honey. And I come back to the question, when is the optimal time to do this later on? Okay, so this is a principle. And now with some pictures from the institute in Kirchhain, where we work usually with 2 supers for the brood nest. And here it's all open, so the honey, we had 2 honey supers at the moment. They are taken down, and then this box is the former upper brood nest, and this is the lower one. And now 2 persons are working there, and they take out every comb, check, and if there is brood, the bees are brushed off or shaken off, and the empty brood combs go here in a separate hive. So looking down into the lower box, we have food combs without any brood put to the side. So there should always be some pollen and honey stores remaining with this hive. And now here in the center, we put the one selected comb which should act as a trapping comb. One good method is, if you know that you are going to use this technique in a week time or 10 days time, cut your drone frame. Let the bees construct a new drone frame, and the queen will start egg laying. That's what we did here. So it's a drone frame. It's highly attractive for the mites, and it has all stages of open brood. But if there's not the right stage of drone brood available, take a worker comb. And if you have just small spots, think about 2 combs which you may use. So there's some flexibility. The principle is just that on those combs, you should be sure that within the next week or 10 days, there are no cells emerging. So if there's any sealed brood left, cut it, open it, so that the mites go out and don't emerge later on with the bees. So that's about the trapping comb. And then you take the rest of the combs and shake them off. It's always nice if you see the queen. Here in this case it's marked, so you feel safe. You know, well, now it's on the box and it's not hurt by the action. But don't be worried. As long as you work carefully, make sure that all the bees are really landed in the brood box and not in the grass side somewhere. The queen must be there, and it works 95%. So shit can happen everywhere. But usually it easily works, and you can be very, very fast with this. At the moment where you want to build brood collectors, of course you need some bees to care for the brood, to warm them up. So some bees should remain on those combs, and if you are not sure about the queen, then don't take the risk. Put all the bees in the lower box, and afterwards you add some bees to the brood collector from the honey room, which is over the queen excluder. So this is a simple solution then. So once all the bees are taken off, you add then empty spaces with wax foundation or with drawn combs. But take the chance to renew the brood nest so that you get new combs down there. And then we put the queen excluder on top. Before it was 2 boxes, now we reduced to 1 box because all the brood is gone. So you have plenty of bees there in this one room, and then we put on top the honey supers as it was before. So this is how it looks like in the brood collectors. You see also here, we make sure that we have some sufficient food given with the brood collectors. We want to be sure that within the next 3 weeks, all the emerging bees have already the food they need inside the box, because they won't collect a lot, and we are not going to feed them if possible. And then about the number of bees needed to care for the brood, it's something between this and this picture. So one hen size of bees, one to each other, on such a full brood comb, this is suitable. So it's about 200, 300 bees per comb site. Like a colony which had intensively swarmed and at the end leaves back some brood with the adhering bees. So this is how it looks like 1 week later. It's exactly the same colony. It's no problem that the wax foundation is drawn. It's just a question of a few days. You know, there are 3 factors which have to be given that bees construct new combs. What is it? Temperature, yeah. Bee density, so let me say. Food. And the food, it's not the stored food in the hive, but there must be some food flow. So if the honey flow is going on, it's fine. They build it within a few days. If you are in a wet weather period, feed them. Give them 1 liter of honey solution, for example, and they will build. And then third thing is the queen must be there. The colony must be queen-right. And this is the case here. So you have an extremely strong swarm if you compare it with a natural condition. And you make sure that there is some food flow. And then after a few days, you get beautiful combs. And there's already some pollen in. And when it comes to the trapping comb, it's now mainly sealed. It was one week later. There are still some open larvae in the lower part of the comb, but the main part is sealed, and there are all the mites in now. And we take this comb, replace it with another drawn worker comb or a foundation, and then the job is done. And about the brood collectors, we usually don't touch them for the next 3 weeks. We put them on a separate position. This is important. As in natural swarming, separate, healthy, and diseased colonies. And there let all the brood emerge. And then after 21 days, you go there. And then you get a realistic picture how many bees are there, so you can adapt the size of the box. You can take out all the old combs which you don't like any longer, replace them with wax foundation. You get an impression if they are queen-right. Probably you won't see the queen. It should be emerged. They will have an emergency queen from the open brood produced. But you can hear it. You can't expect egg laying at that time, 3 weeks after the split. The young queen is there, but it's on the way to get mated soon. And then use this 1 day and have a treatment. For example, with formic acid, or what goes best is oxalic acid, one-time trickling or evaporation. Highly efficient. You take out the mites, and then you have plenty of young bees. So you start to feed them, and you can develop new colonies out of this. Usually those queens are not of high quality, but still it's the easiest way to replace them later. Let them start egg laying, and then you can easily replace them later if you're not satisfied. I know some people use these brood collectors even to produce some new queens. You can do this. Then you would open them after a week or latest 9 days after the split, take out all the emergency cells. Meanwhile, there are plenty of young bees which already emerged, and then give them some good breeding stuff to rear queens. That can be combined. Okay, what happens on the longer term? So first of all, when we started to check those methods about 10, 12 years ago, we were curious about the strengths. When we take out all the brood end of June, beginning of July, what happens about the winter size of the colonies? And there were a big comparison, and many beekeepers were also involved. And here you see the result. It was just the same. There's no significant difference. The colonies need 6 to 8 weeks to recover with a normal brood production, normal colony strength, but then they are fine. And the bees are more healthy, so they have a good development. What's about Varroa infestation? We compared it, control colonies, where we had an intensive treatment after the honey harvest with formic acid. to colonies where we don't had any chemical treatment, just this brood removal combined with a trapping comb. The infestation level is nearly the same, no significant difference. It's as effective as an intensive chemical treatment. What's about honey production in the next season? Or, yeah, next season. In this case, it was the next season where colonies which we treated the same way before. But the test which I show here is, in 1 year we built 4 groups, 8 colonies each, within one apiary. And there was a control group here, where we didn't take any brood, where again we had a formic acid treatment after the honey harvest. And then on the left we had 3 groups where we removed all the brood at different times. And on the left you have the first group. We took the brood on the 20th of May. This is a normal swarming period in our region. So we wanted to see what happens if we do what nature usually does. And as you can easily see, we had a very low honey production in those colonies, on average about 8 kilograms. There was some honey already in the hives which you could harvest, but nothing came afterwards. And this is the reason why we try to prevent swarming in early May. We lose too much of our honey flow then. The colonies were excellent. They wintered so well, so it's beautiful to see. And this is why nature has this swarming at that time. It's a perfect situation to get healthy colonies for the next winter. But for the beekeeper, it was a disaster. So the next group was exactly 3 weeks later. And there you have a huge variability. Some colonies did a good crop with more than 30 kilograms of honey, so they were already very strong. But some other colonies didn't give any honey because they were still under development. The best solution was this year, again 3 weeks later, 3rd of July, where we had the honey harvest, the final honey harvest on the 17th of July, exactly 2 weeks later. And those colonies did even better than the control group. And this may be surprising on the first glance, but if you think about what happens inside the hive, it gets clear. You take out all the brood, but all the foragers which can help to collect honey within the next 10, 14 days are already there. And you stimulate the colony. It gets very active, building up a new brood nest. But for the next 2 weeks, the main consumers, which are the brood and the young bees emerging and then building up their substance, are gone. So you still have the same intake of nectar, but you have a reduced consumption of the hive itself. And what we harvest at beekeepers always is different. Most of the honey is taken by the bees themselves. We just take a small portion which is left over, and here the leftover portion is increasing. So you can use this. And this answers already the question about the best timing. Don't take out all the brood when you expect a good honey flow 4 or 6 weeks later. It would be a disaster. Yeah. So the colonies are then in the period of recovering. But if you can do it a week or 2 weeks before the final harvest, it's perfect. It's easy working on the hives. They easily reconstruct the combs. At the moment where you take the last honey, there is already a grown brood nest again. You can adapt the colony size and so give them some more space, add the winter food, and leave for your holiday. The colonies are in the very best condition then. So this is perfect timing. Yeah. And it depends on your local conditions. So you have to check this. I can't give a general recommendation for a certain date, but you see the principle. Okay. This was in detail total brood removal. Now I will be faster about the other 2 methods because the principle is always the same. But explaining the classical trapping comb technique, which is known since about 25 years already, and there are beekeepers who don't do anything else since that time. But still, also in our region, it's not the favor of the beekeepers. It's my personal favor. When I mentioned yesterday in a smaller group that I don't treat with any chemicals my private hives since years, it's because I use this method. So what are we doing here? Sorry that the graph is in German. I couldn't change it, but I will explain everything. The circle starts here. You have to find the queen, and you put the queen on 1 or 2 or maximum maybe 3 combs. So a very limited area where she can go on with egg laying. And this lasts then, for example, for 9 days. There is some flexibility. It can be a week, can be 10 days, but it should be within this range. So the queen will lay plenty of eggs on this limited area. And then after this time, you take the comb and put them in the center of the colony nest. So there's plenty of open brood now available. And within the next 10 days, the mites will go into these combs. There is no other open brood left in the hive, meanwhile. It's all sealed. So all the mites which emerge from the brood have only the chance on the selected trapping comb. And then another 9 days later, you come and take the comb, which is then completely sealed. There's plenty of mites inside. You take it out, and you melt it, and the mites are gone. The queen is further on working, so you place them on a second comb and repeat the procedure. The second comb is going to the hive while the queen is going to a third comb, and then after the third circle, that means about 27 days after the initial start, you release the queen, but still this last trapping comb is remaining in the hive for the next few days because there's the open brood now for the mites to go in. And then the procedure is done finally after another 9 days, so somewhere about 35 days after the initial start, with taking out the sealed third brood comb. So this is the whole procedure, as I said, with some flexibility. But this period of about 28 days is sufficient to attract about 95% of the mites. And the queen is going on with egg laying, so it's not a problem to get it accepted afterwards when you release it in the hive. But at that moment, you have the chance again to take out all the old combs to reorganize the brood nest to make sure that you have a good hygiene standard in your hive. So in practice, this is one way with a single comb here in the queen excluder. And you may use such an empty comb, but you can also take the eldest comb from the brood nest, from which you know this should be taken out anyhow, as long as there is some space for the queen to lay eggs. Don't care in this case about sealed brood cell, which may emerge within the next few days. They emerge anyhow in the hive, if it's on the trapping comb or outside, doesn't matter. Just make sure that the queen get a chance to lay eggs. We put a hole in the center of the comb, so to be sure when we mounted the queen excluder on the back side already that we can introduce the queen through this hole and she doesn't run around while we close the top side. This is typical mistake that you get in hurry and then you press the queen and you have a stem but no longer working queen. So these are the small things you may adapt. And then it's closed and you put it in the center of the hive. And now the queen is working here among other brood combs. This is how it looks like then 1 week later, with plenty of open brood produced by the queen, eggs and larvae all over, and this comb goes then as trapping comb into the brood nest. And then again, 1 week later, you have these completely sealed combs which you can easily take out. One remark for those who work with just the one-box brood nest. This is from my private hives. I keep my colonies on Dadant. Then it's even easier working because there you can use a vertical queen excluder. Make sure that it closes to the bottom and put the normal queen excluder on top, so you have like a cage on one side of the hive. And then you are flexible. You can work with 1 or with 2 or 3 combs just as you like, and you don't have to open anything. Just put in the comb with the queen and a week later, you shake off the bees, the queen remains there, and you exchange the comb. It's very fast working, just a few minutes. And I used to give them then 2 combs, always the cutted drone comb, where they can go on with comb construction that gives some activity in the cage of the queen, and the drawn worker comb where the queen can lay eggs. So you prolong the period where the queen can easily lay eggs day by day. So this is what happens in the hive. We measured natural mite mortality, and we saw how it went up, and then came the trapping comb period, and it goes deeply down. And then week 28, which is something about the beginning of August, we are on a very low level. So the best guarantee to get healthy winter bees afterwards. Last not least, the most simple method for large-scale beekeeping, and we learned this first of all from professional beekeepers in Italy, where they have huge problems nowadays. They have a lot of resistance in the mite population against classical substances, and they have in many places brood all around the year. So it's very common now in Italy that beekeepers, for 1 or even 2 periods in the season, cage the queens, even with big colony numbers, 1,000 colonies and more. So we learned from them and said, well, how does it work? Does the queen accept this? And they accept very well if you use the right cage. So this cage was imported from Italy. Meanwhile, it's available in Germany with our dealers. I don't know about the situation here, but you can easily get it on the European market. The trick is the cage is as thick as the comb is thick, and it's not somewhere hanging between combs, but it's mounted in the comb. And when it goes to the center of the brood nest, then the bees run over the cage on both sides, and there's a queen excluder on both sides. It's a bit more narrow than a normal queen excluder to ensure that the queen, even if she's not laying, never comes out. But the workers still can easily go in and out. And that way, the queen is all the time in intensive contact to the nurse bees around. So the colony feels queen right, and the queen is easily accepted if you release it afterwards. So with those cages, she can remain for, the standard is 25 days. That's what we adapted from Italy, but it can even be longer. I know beekeepers who came to me after talks and said, well, I was not ready to tell it in the auditorium, but what do you think about? I missed to release the queen in some of my hives, so they stayed there for 60 days. Is this a problem? The queen was alive, the colony developed well. So it's amazing how well it is accepted and what you can do there. And it's amazing to see how colonies where you have this artificial brood interruption keep their strength, because the lifetime of bees is mainly depending on their brood care activity. At the moment where there's brood rearing going on, the clock is running. But if there is no brood available, young bees emerge, and they are like winter bees, long living, until brood production starts again. And this is an important aspect when it comes to the best timing for these methods. It's nearly the same with the trapping comb, and it's definitely true for the caging story. At the moment where you cage the queen, the colonies get stronger, because all the remaining brood is emerging. So there are more and more bees, but they live for longer. So the colonies get stronger. And then, of course, at a certain time, they start to weaken when bees die because they are too old, and especially when you start brood production again, then they get weaker. But these methods are perfectly placed if you can start with it about 4 weeks before your final honey harvest. So I usually do it in the middle of June already. Then I know I get a better honey harvest in the following few weeks. And when I take the last honey about the mid of July or 20th of July, then the colonies are rid of mites at the same time. And I release the queen and things work very well. So there's some flexibility, but you can use this to improve the honey harvest. To finish the story about the caging, you lose quite a number of mites during this caging period by natural processes. But to optimize the effect, use then a one-time treatment. And the easiest way is with oxalic acid. Evaporation works perfectly there. It's not registered in Germany. We would like to get it. You are in a lucky situation here in Britain. We do it with trickling, and it works well at the moment where you have the right dosage. So it's about 3 times higher than during the winter treatment. We have much more bees in the hive, and they are very active. So we use up to 135 milliliters of oxalic acid solution to trickle those strong colonies in summertime, but then it works perfectly. Okay, this is from research activities, what happens to the colony strength, and here we had a control group. As before, with formic acid treatment after the honey harvest. This is, in a way, the standard procedure in Germany at the moment. And we had a second group where we got a total brood removal 10 days before the final honey harvest. And then we had 2 groups where we caged the queen. The first group caging was done in July, so at the same time with the total brood removal. And then it went for 4 weeks. That means we released the queens somewhere in the mid of August. And the last group, the queens were caged in August and then released in September. And what is shown here is the development of colony strength. We measured how many bees were present in the mid of July when we started with this procedure and compared it to the number of bees which were present in early spring the following season. So this is the most critical test. What remains until next spring? And you see the effect. Total brood removal was nearly the same as the formic acid treatment. In any case, not worse than that. But caging strengthens the colonies. And the same is with trapping comb. You start with stronger colonies and with a better health status of those hives. And this is really a difference. I mean, if you have about 40% of the July population in early March, or if you have 60%, that makes a difference. It's 50% more on bees. That gives you better honey harvest the next season. So it's wise to do this, not only with regard to Varroa, but also for your harvest. So what happens here again, you have the model, and you see it's very similar to the natural swarming, but postponed. It's 4 weeks later, so the curve is slightly different. And as we use the trick of the trapping comb or combine it with a one-time treatment, we even have a stronger reduction in the mite population. And we are far below this critical level. You never have a risk to get problems with the winter bee population in this case. So this is really a safe thing. And this is a structural change, which I meant in the beginning when I said our problem is not about the availability or efficacy of modern drugs. It's a question of the treatment concept. And this is what you should go for. Still, there's a problem. Not all the beekeepers do the same thing at the same time. And you may have done a very good job in June, July to get healthy colonies started for the winter bee production. But then in the neighborhood, colonies collapse, and we have the problem of reinvasion. Or even with those methods, you can make mistakes. The trapping comb was not working well or whatever. So to be on the safe side, you have to combine these early treatments with a later on control. So what we usually do is somewhere about the end of August to get a sample of bees or to use natural mite mortality control to be sure that we really remain below certain thresholds. And these are the methods. So you can, you have this bottom board control of natural mite mortality, or you take the bee samples and you wash them, or you have the powder sugar method, or you can even work with CO2 to narcotize the bees, and the mites are dropping down then. I think you are familiar with these techniques. Interesting are the values. This is from our German experience. Probably it's not so much different here, but should be checked. If you have the bottom inserts, it shouldn't be more than 10 to 20 dark mites dropping down per day. This is a critical level in the period of August, September. If it's more, then it's better to have an additional treatment. At the end of the season, now, at this time when the bees are already clustering and there is no brood any longer, so the mortality of mites is going down, and that means lower mite numbers indicate a higher infestation in the hive. So this is why the value is much lower here now. We prefer the bee sampling method because it's more accurate, and there we usually take about 50 grams of bees. This comes close to 500 bees. And then if we have less than 15 mites there, we know we are below 3% infestation level, and this is fine. This is fine in August, September. We don't worry any longer. And as it's the end of the season, all the mites are on the bees, and it's below this 1%, everything is fine. You can easily winter with higher infestation levels, and we do this for our research on resistance selection. There we go up to 20, 25 mites. So there's still some reserve, but those values may be suitable for you. Okay, at the end, I would like to show the principal comparison of the methods. And this is the curve you have seen before. This is what most of you do at the moment. Start with as low mite numbers as possible in spring, and then have this build up until the first treatment somewhere after the honey harvest. And then if you use formic acid or thymol, you don't kill 100% of the mites, but you bring it down, and it goes up again, and then you have a second or a third treatment. So this is the way how we classically do it. The alternative is what I have shown before. You don't depend on a winter treatment. Usually you winter your colonies with clearly higher mite numbers. And then when the brood starts, they dilute on the brood, but then of course they go up. But before you reach a critical level, you have this interruption somewhere in June, July. You bring it down. The lowest level is at the end of July, beginning of August. And then again, you have a build-up during the winter bee production period, but you remain below this critical level. So this is the two models. And now check what happens about the population which decides about wintering success. Those bees are produced in this period, August, September. Compare the mite loads. It's several times higher with your classical chemical system than it is with this biotechnical model. And this is the reason why you can clearly reduce winter losses if you change to this method. But please go one step further and think about selection and what we discussed yesterday. I already announced there is such a close link between the two methods. And this comes from the natural mating period, because this is in May and June. And when we see that within a few generations, resistant populations could develop in areas where man doesn't interfere, this was due to the strong effects of Varroa on the drone population. At the moment where you have mites in the hive, each cell which is infested won't bring a drone which is not able to succeed in the mating competition afterwards. So there is a natural model which ensures that you have a very strong selection for healthy drones. What we do with our chemical winter treatment, we take out the mites from this natural selection procedure. We will never achieve resistant populations in the hand of beekeepers if they use intensive winter treatment. And this is what you see here. We don't have mites during this period, but with the natural model, the peak of mites is exactly in this time. That makes a huge difference. So this is a long-term perspective. If we want to achieve sometime a resistant population, then we have to switch the treatment system. And you can easily do it because it gives you more security and it makes you independent from these chemical drugs. This is the message I want to bring to you. And this is, at the end, nice example. I got those 2 slides, which I show now from Steve Riley. Many of you know him. It's from the Western Beekeeper Association, where a group of beekeepers started to switch over to those methods. And they were happy to show those data. It's the natural mite mortality of 3 sample hives, which they show here. And they used this queen trapping technique here at that time. And you see how they bring down the swarms. And here on these 2 colonies, they use the shock swarm or the total brood removal, and it worked excellent. So at the end of the season, they had very low infestation levels, no problem. And here's for this one hive a more detailed graph where you see the extension of brood in the hive, and there was a artificial swarm period here in this time, which brought down the mite loads already. And then there was this trapping comp used here later the season in July, and it brought it down to a harmless level of infestation. So they made some good experience already with these methods, and I'm happy to show those data here to be sure that it's not only the German experience, it works all over. The bees are the same, and the nature is more or less the same.
Could I ask you a question? I'll cheat because I'm at the front. How do you, the natural swarming season is May, but what you would like to do is to do these things in June, July. So how do you get around that? How do you deal with the swarm cells arriving?
Okay. So actually, we avoid swarming, and we.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah. So the first thing is that we select on low swarm tendency, and there is great success. So many of the colonies don't tend to swarm any longer, really. Right. So even with a good pollen flow in May, we don't observe too much of swarming activity, and then we may have intermediate splits of the hive to prevent swarming at the moment where they start. So this is a standard procedure. Yes. But the timing really depends very much on the honey flow. And we in our region, we have a strong flow in early spring. Yes. So end of April, May is the main honey flow. And if we have swarming in this period, we lose too much of the harvest. But then the flow is usually going on until the mid of July. Yes. Less strong than it is in May. And therefore, we do best if we can prevent the splitting of hives until the end of June.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. Right. I'm sure there's lots and lots of questions. If you could stand up and a roving microphone will come to you. First question, please.
I've been typically shook swarming in mid-March, if the season allowed me, over the last few years. My assumption was that it would hit the mites and it would slow down swarming. Although I have to say I did it on all colonies this year, and I went from 5 to 15 colonies, so you can see how well that worked. Anyhow, I just wondered whether you had any comparison between what you're suggesting, which is a much later action there, and going in so early. I'm quite willing to be convinced. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting for me to hear about it. We don't have experience with this very early shook swarm technique. What is interesting, I know from Italian beekeepers that meanwhile many of them cage the queen about 6 weeks before the first honey flow, or they cage early and they release about 6 weeks before the first honey flow, because they noticed then after the release of the queen, they build up a strong brood nest, and this gives the strongest hives for the flow. So it's meanwhile a management technique for them to optimize the flow ability of the hives by caging. Maybe this goes in a similar direction. So, but personally, I don't have experience with this early brood interruption. So please.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. In using your caging technique, how long do you cage the queen for?
Yeah. So the standard is 25 days. You can adapt it a little bit, also depending on the infestation level. So if the infestation is quite low, you may stop after 21, 22 days, so all the brood is gone. You can renew the combs and release the queen at that time. But as I said, it's also not a problem to cage them for 5 weeks' time, 35 days. So there's really flexibility about this.
I use a mesh, open mesh floor and a screen under to count the Varroa. Mm-hmm. If for argument's sake I get, say, 60 Varroa might drop in a 7-day period. That's just looking at the Varroa tray or counting them. If I take off the debris and use methylated spirit, dissolve it in the debris in methylated spirit, that count of, say, 60 could go up to 200, 250. Mm. And a lot of those ones that now become countable are not the dark Varroa, but the lighter ones that I otherwise missed. In your talk, you put that word in, that word dark, and you said counting dark Varroa. So do you ignore the lighter ones? That's my question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. For this simple counting, we recommend to ignore it, just to go for the dark mites, because it's closely related with the total mite population. The light mites are always interesting to see and to count when it comes to the question, is there recent reproduction of mites in the hive? This is what the light mites tell us. But here we just want to get an idea about the infestation level, and then you can easily go with the dark mites, which are more safe to count, quicker to count. And one further advice, in earlier days we also recommended check for at least 7 days, maybe better 2 weeks to be on the safe side. We had to change this advice. We tell now just leave the control boards for 2 or 3 days. Otherwise it gets too much trash on, it's more difficult to count. But what is even worse, you attract ants, you attract earworms and so on. You get wax moths down there, and all those animals can take away mites. So you get a growing mistake. Just go for these short control intervals. 2 days is sufficient. You get an idea about the infestation level. It's not about exact numbers. It's just to see, is it 10 mites, is it 20 mites, where are we standing? And then it's fine. Yeah. Easy working.
Do you keep the queen caged on the same frame the whole time, or do you move her from frame to frame within the brood nest?
No. So with these Italian cages, what I call the caging technique, it's just in one frame, and the frame is somewhere in the center of the nest. Interesting to see from the Italian experience, many beekeepers nowadays have a cage in the brood nest all the year round. It's all the time there. And whenever they like to cage, they just take the queen, put it in, and release it afterwards. So we don't do this, but the cage remains the same for the treatment period. Yeah.
But for the trapping frames,
about the trapping comb technique, I showed both versions. So in this one box, brood nest, I had the queen in this side cage, which was separated by a vertical queen excluder. And this remains. And you put in an empty comb and you take out the comb with open brood. So that's the way in this system. And the alternative is this one comb caging. And there, of course, you have to change the comb each week or every 9 days. Yeah.
With the caging of the queen, is there any comb in the cage, or are you just leaving her to wander around and be fed by the workers? And,
yeah.
if so, is she going to be harmed in her subsequent egg-laying capacity for not laying any eggs for 20-odd days, please?
Yeah, interesting and important question. So the cages which I showed here and which we did most of our research with is without any comb. It's 2.5 centimeters thick cage, empty cage, and there is not sufficient space for the bees to build a comb. There are alternative models, cages of the same thickness with a foundation on one side, so there remains some space for the queen to lay eggs on. And there are even wider cages where you really have a comb in. So all the models. And there's some discussion going on what is better for the physiology of the queens. So we did some testing this summer in comparing such cages. And so far we couldn't find a clear difference. We lose some of the queens. So in many years, it's just 2–3%. So we cage about 100, 150 queens each season in the institute. So we have some experience, and often it's below 5%. But in 2018, with this extremely hot and dry season and a low brood production in the hive, we got some problems. So the queen losses went up to about 15%. And this is why we started the comparison of the cages now. But it's probably mainly a physiological effect because there was low brood production before. You have more elder bees in the hive. And the queen acceptance gets more difficult. And then the typical symptoms was the queen was alive in the cage. And we released it. And it started egg laying. Not a problem to get the queen egg laying after such a long interruption. But then on the first eggs, these elder bees start to raise emergency cells. So this happens. But this also happens in normal hives. So at the end, we are not 100% sure right now, but I would like to say it seems to be completely harmless for the queen. Seems to be completely harmless as long as she is in this continuous contact with the nurse bees around. Yeah.
Going on from that question, it just interests me that you've got a queen in there and the bees have got all this space for her to lay in. Are they trying to overfeed her to try to produce eggs to lay up because they don't really know that she's in prison, do they? Sorry, I
did not fully understand. She's in the cage, yeah, and there's space. You said.
Yeah, I would have thought that the bees would have tried to overfeed the queen to produce the eggs.
No. It's like in swarm preparation. There is no chance for the queen to lay eggs, and they reduce the diet. So you can clearly see the queen gets smaller. She's less fat, so there is no chance to lay, and afterwards she recovers again. Then the bees adapt the diet for the queen. Thank you. Thank you very much.